It's really an honor to be here, and I've learned so much yesterday, and I'm trying to make some remarks that will, I hope, build on what I heard. And I'm going to talk to you now about the work that AFSC is doing today and the way that it reflects the same values and the same intention that you found here in Lapland in 1945. I just remind you that the American Friends Service Committee was formed in 1917. It was only a few weeks after the US decided to enter World War I. And as is very common in the US and perhaps here in Europe, as soon as the country declares war, things like this poster appear, and it becomes a part of the important culture in the country that everyone contribute, and that war is then presented as a way of actually making the world safe and peaceful. So Friends were concerned that young Quakers might be drawn into this war fever. And they wanted to offer an alternative way to serve peace, a way that would try what love can do instead of what bombs and guns and war can do in order to bring peace in the world. So we went very optimistically in 1917, first to France and Germany, and then thought a lot about what our work was in the period of the 1920s and 30s, and then World War II, as that formed, again found ourselves drawn back to Europe to do work in the spirit of love. And I want to just say what I think we learned and what I heard yesterday that I think we learned from this. We did learn what the terrible face of war looked like, that it leaves children hungry and without homes, and it's really not a way to peace, a path to peace. But we also learned that it's not enough to just meet the physical needs, not enough to just provide food and clothing and shelter. And what you see over here is a photo from one of the work camps. Because we listened to the local people and said, "What do you need?" These young people are collecting bricks for a sauna, because that is an important part of the healing and the culture in this part of the world. We also learned, I think, of the power of taking young people into this kind of service as a transforming experience for themselves and for those around them, and the importance of how those young people then developed into the leaders of the next generation for peace and justice. And finally, we learned that it's very important as peacemakers to actually engage with everyone, wherever they may be. In 1917, as you all know, the Soviet Union was formed as a result of the Russian Revolution. And almost as soon as we went to France and Germany, the American Friends Service Committee sent relief aid to Russia, but there was famine. This is when we began our first entry in the FBI file, which is quite long, on the American Friends Service Committee, as a result of giving aid and comfort to the communist enemy. So it's important, though, that we engage with everyone. If we wish to make peace with our enemy, we must speak with our enemy. So I want to quickly turn to where we are today. The world has changed. War and violence don't look the same as it did in 1917 or even in 1945. And I want to say where I think we are heading. I think we have retained, despite the changes, despite the fact that we now have not so much wars between states although that still happens, as we have terrorist organizations and stateless actors who are part of the scene. But we still believe that our job is to prepare and inspire young people to change the tired old narratives that were on that poster and still exist today, that war is the answer, that when something bad happens, the answer is to drop a bomb, send a drone, do something militarily to make that right. We also think that we have a real need to look to the continuing development of our leaders for the future, for peace and justice. There's a statement that I heard first at a Seder from a Jewish text. You are not expected to complete the work in your lifetime, but you may not refuse to do your unique part. So I think that we understand that the work will not be completed in our lifetime, but we have to prepare for the future. So I want to try to capture what we do today by telling you 3 stories that I hope will exemplify the lessons that we have learned. The first story will be about some work that we have done in Burundi, and a small amount about how that also looks in Zimbabwe. And this is how we now go into post-conflict areas to work on building and restoring community. The second story will be about the work we are now doing in Guatemala and Los Angeles. And this is work that we are doing in order to address the problems of migration, of immigration, that have been present in the US and now we have seen happening in Europe as well. And the final story will be about the work of engagement that AFSC has done since 1980 with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, another one of those pariah states. So let me talk about Burundi first. The American Friends Service Committee went into Burundi in about 2007 or 8, just as the civil war was coming to an end there that had been a spillover from the Rwandan genocide. And one of the things that the Burundi government did was to establish peace villages. The peace villages were meant to be a place where internally displaced persons who had been moved from their original villages could find a home, where those who were returning, who had actually evacuated and become refugees elsewhere, could return, and where ex-combatants could come back. And the peace villages were going to be added on to a traditional village, a host community. And new housing was built for the returning refugees and internally displaced persons and former combatants. And they were given new homes, which you can see here actually look quite nice, but no land. And since in this agrarian society, land was the way that you made a living, there was a problem for these returnees because they came with a home, but with no means of support. There was another problem for the host community. The host community had been burdened because of the war with the orphan children who needed to be taken care of and the widows who were trying to find livelihood, and they did not think that they had enough land, although they had the land for agricultural use, to actually feed all of these additional people who are coming into the community. In addition, the ex-combatants are coming in to places where they had actually murdered members of the families of the people around them. So the Peace Village sounded like a good name, but it was not necessarily a peaceful location. When we went into Burundi, we began working with Burundi Evangelical Friends. The Evangelical Friends in Burundi are a really inspiring group of people who have done an amazing amount of service in their community and in Africa. I wish that some of our wealthy American meetings did 1/10 as much as Bujumbura Friends do around their country. But we worked with them because they had developed something called Healing and Rebuilding Our Communities, a workshop and a series of workshops that would help heal trauma and help bring people together and reconcile some of the past wrongs. And this was a very effective workshop that they now had 50 people who were trying to implement this all throughout Burundi. And we began to work with them to come into peace villages and to offer this kind of healing and reconciliation approach. And it was not only a workshop, but also as people went through the trauma workshop, the healing workshop, they were given companions in the community who could help them find their own path to forgiveness and to accepting responsibility for what they had done. One of the things that many of the ex-combatants did was to take responsibility for the orphan children and to say, these are children that I will pay for their school. I will find a way to support them as they go through life. But healing and reconciliation still didn't deal with the underlying problems that the Peace Village had of not having a way for people to make a living. So we began to work with other community partners to develop a series of trainings that would bring people together. It would do two things. It would give them some skills, marketable skills in things like tailoring or carpentry or masonry or hairdressing. But it would also do this by bringing them together in groups to learn the trade and to create a kind of social cohesion as they went through this process together of figuring out how to make a living. And we partnered with many different organizations that were already there doing some of this training. We didn't try to recreate it or do it in a new way, but again, to bring local partners in to do that work. Finally, we realized that we needed a way to have economic integration. People had skills, but they needed to have equipment sometimes to operate those skills. They needed to be able to buy fabric in order to do their tailoring. And we set up a micro-lending bank that the villagers could operate themselves. And they began to put money in and to lend each other money so that they could begin to develop these businesses that they needed to have. The other thing that we did, we observed that they all had smartphones. You see them on the table there. And we sent our director of information technology to Burundi. And he has developed a little app that they can use on their smartphones to actually run the bank, to run the micro-lending bank. So we brought some technology that was suitable for them, but we didn't try to assume that we had the answers to their problems. There's a wonderful YouTube video that was done that's available if you go to the AFSC YouTube channel. You can find it that talks about this work. One of the ex-combatants has become the head of the bank in his village. He expresses he never thought he could have that kind of trust in this community coming back as an ex-combatant, but this is how it has gone. We have done a lot of other work in Burundi. This work in the villages is part of it. The villages are, that we've worked in, I think, are less fragile than they were. The recent election violence that went on, our villages did retain a level of peace that was reassuring. But we've also worked at other levels. We've worked with the Quaker UN office in New York to try to bring the voices of these peace villagers, of the ordinary Burundians, into the processes that the New York peace-building operation is doing. We have connected with the Swiss representative who is actually working with the government in Burundi and brought that voice there. We have also brought other African leaders and members of the African Union together as we were trying to help keep the peace around election violence and also help the Burundian government set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there's other work, but this has been work that I think is closest to the heart of what happened in the work camps here in 1945. I'll just say that this is an exportable model, just as the work camps were. And we took this same model to Zimbabwe, a slightly different situation there, where a village had been displaced because it was seen as being in political opposition to Mugabe. And the village was leveled, and people were sent to this empty field with no housing and no food and no shelter and no livelihoods. And we worked the same kind of model in that place, and you can see there's some welded window and door frames in the background that are not too clear. A door is being built out in, and you see the shacks and the shanties that people are living in. We brought together people with enough skills in carpentry, masonry, welding, and other things that we were able to pour foundations, and then these groups were able to build each other's houses. And as a result of building the houses and becoming and changing the whole scene, the Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises of the government that had at first displaced this group realized that they had something that was actually working in terms of economic development. And we were able to get permission to build this lovely factory shell with the help of a donor that brought in electricity and water. And it also gave a place for people to do their crafts, their businesses, not just out in the street in front of their home, but in a place that was suited to that. So another example of then exporting that model to another place. So we don't do work camps in that way, but I think we have the heart of trying to work with the community to meet their needs in sustainable ways and to set in motion things that will make a difference. So let me talk about the second body of work, the second story. This is a logo that was created by some of the young people we work with in San Francisco, who are undocumented immigrants in the US. They wish the butterfly is the welcome migrant that comes from Mexico to the US, and they wish that people could be as welcome as the butterfly. And one of the things that we have been doing is trying to work not only in the US, but also to work in the sending countries, such as Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico, to see what are the things that are causing people to come and what can we do about that. So let me tell you a little bit about Guatemala City, where we have been working now for several years. And we've been working in some of the barrios that are really captured at this point by the narco criminals. The violence it's hard to describe, but a quick story. When the criminals in one of the barrios where we work, El Limon, wanted to stop the government from putting a public bus route through the barrio, they murdered a young woman, dismembered her, and left a body part at each of the proposed bus stops as a sign that this should not go forward. That's the kind of violence that's in these communities. So we have been working with young people in these communities using a model that we developed called Peace Networks, where the young people come together and try to find something in the community that they can make a difference about. And one young man, Pablo Ramirez, got the idea that what would really help is to reclaim some of the space that has been taken away, and found this empty ravine. It just is nothing. It doesn't look like anything, and thought it could become a football field. Football was something that you could actually reach out across. If you had a football field, it would be a safe space. That is, everybody loved football, including the crime lords. So Pablo began working. We provided some tools and equipment. He brought in not only other young people, but also the parents began to come after work to help with doing this. And in a few short weeks, there was a football field. but also it became a safe place for the community to gather for many other events. And there's a community meeting that's being pictured over here. There's been a farmer's market that's happened there on a regular basis, and many other things. This is one project that Pablo has done. There have been dozens of projects in Guatemala City that the young people have done, reclaiming space and reclaiming a place for themselves around the peace networks. I will say that this whole approach grew out of a dialogue that we created with academics in Latin America and with community activists, who then developed this manual, which, if any of you are interested, you can find on our website. It's available in English and Spanish, not yet in Finnish, but if one of you wants to volunteer to translate, that would be a possibility. And we are using this same approach in Haiti and in Guatemala, and we're bringing it into Mexico. The other side, so when we were working in Guatemala, I guess about a year ago, when a number of unaccompanied minors were coming across to the US, this work offered us an opportunity to go and speak to our representatives in the government, to the media, with a different voice that most people were not able to bring in the US of what is happening in Guatemala City. Why are these young people coming? What is the story? But we also have been working for a long time in the US, and I want to just say a little bit about how that work looks inside the US. This is a project that I know well because I was the regional director in Los Angeles before I became the general secretary in Philadelphia. And this is a project that we were doing at what's called a continuation high school. This is a high school where the students who had been expelled and suspended from the regular schools could come for one last chance to get a diploma. And there were about 20 or 25 students, one teacher, and they were all involved in some way with gangs and gang violence. The young man there in the black shirt is Elmo Gomez. And Elmo was shot 3 times outside of Venice High School before he came to this continuation high school. And he was a pretty alienated, helpless young man, as were most of the students in the school. But we began to work with them, and they developed relationships with each other. We had them do what is called a video dialogue, where they made a little video of somebody that they admired in their community. They used pictures, photographs, music, voiceover, and they worked together, and then we helped them load them up on YouTube. Got them talking to each other. They then decided they wanted to do an organic garden in the weedy patch outside of the school. Quite a surprise to me. I didn't think they would be interested in this. We were doing work with organic farming in New Mexico, and we had some good curricula, and we also had some allies. Again, we work with the community. A professor from Santa Monica Community College came in and taught classes on how to do organic gardening, on photosynthesis, on soil preparation. We had a carpenter who came in who showed them how to build raised beds and prepare those things. And actually, to my surprise, this garden was a huge success. The students had to work with the housing project where the school was located. They were not well beloved. They were seen as the gang kids, you know, but they went in to get permission to do this project, and it began to transform their relationship. One of the things we have learned is that when young people who have been marginalized and not permitted to act are given the opportunity to make a difference in something that affects them, it's actually a spiritual journey for them. And this is a statement that Elmo made. He became so in love with organic gardening, he began bringing clippings around to other residents in the housing project and encouraging them to plant gardens in front of their own houses. And he said, just like you can internalize the prison, you can internalize the garden too. I'm a person of practice, conscious and consciousness and action come out of the garden. I have a vision of a wholly changed social structure with the garden at the center. I will just say to you that it turned out that there's a federal housing authority rule that says you can't plant vegetables in your gardens in housing projects. So this was an opportunity for Elmo to actually organize his neighbors, and they were able to get permission to finally have a community garden in their housing project. But even more amazing things happened for Elmo. He left the high school, he graduated, and about a year and a half later, I was in a meeting in the Labor and Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles to hear about a program that was trying to end what was called zero tolerance policies in the schools in California. Zero tolerance meant that if you had any weapon or drugs, you were not sent to the principal's office, you were sent to juvenile court. And it happened to children as young as 9 years old if they had a butter knife, a plastic knife in their backpack, or aspirin. This was enough to get them suspended and expelled. More children were being suspended and expelled in California than graduated from high school every year. So the program was bringing 6 bills to the state legislature to replace zero tolerance with a restorative justice peer mediation approach to discipline in the schools. And they had gotten the support of the teachers' unions, and they had gotten the support of many of the police agencies. And they would organize young people in Northern and Southern California, and lo and behold, Elmo was the Southern California organizer. And he came into this meeting to present this plan for action for bringing this to the legislature. 6 months later, 5 of the 6 bills were signed into law. 1 year later, the report was that suspensions and expulsions had dropped by 12 and 14%. 2 years later, they had dropped again by 20 and 15%. At this point in Los Angeles County, suspensions and expulsions are half of what they were 2.5 years ago. This is what Elmo was able to achieve, along with others in his community. So this is an example of the planting a seed and not knowing exactly where it will go.
How about the use of drugs and weapons in school? What happened to that statistic?
The use of drugs and weapons in schools has not increased as a result of this. Actually, I was in San Diego County. San Diego, the schools are so excited about this that San Diego is trying to make the whole county a restorative justice county. And they actually have gotten the courts to agree that for simple cases involving young people, they can be judged by peers of high school students. And they've set up a court that is actually handling these cases. And they do it through really bringing people in the same way that healing, you have to have forgiveness, but you also have to have taking responsibility for what you have done, and that is what is transformative about practice. It doesn't really stop there, because we actually have another opportunity. We bring young people together across the many different places we work with youth. We do similar work with youth in about 16 places. And every year, we can take them to the annual gathering of the Nobel Peace Laureates, as an organization that accepted the prize for Friends along with the British Peace and Social, it was Friends Service Council at that point. We are able to be represented there. And what you see is, this is Elmo in Warsaw. And he's wearing a keffiyeh. He met the Palestinian delegates that we had also brought there, learned a lot about international things that he had known nothing about before. This is a young man with Myred Corrigan McGuire. This is a young woman who's been working on some of our micro-lending, getting to spend time with Muhammad Yunus, who formed the Grameen Bank. It's a very inspiring opportunity. And We also went to a youth Indaba, which is a kind of dialogue in Cape Town last year. And at that place, Pablo Ramirez, who's there, a young man from Guatemala City, actually was able to meet Rebecca Nindorera, who's from Burundi, and they could share information about what they were doing in their different communities. And also Elmo was there. So there was a real opportunity for exchange of ideas. And Pablo left and he said, I have many great ideas. And he's stayed in touch with Rebecca since this meeting. So let me go to the last story and try to quickly get through this. If we're going to end war, we really have to do something rather dramatic. We have to have a new paradigm. And that paradigm is something that we developed with friends in the US called shared security. None of us is safe unless all of us is safe. None of us is secure unless all of us is secure. So the way to security is to think about who needs what and to help provide that. In the US, there is no more hated regime and no more misunderstood regime than that of North Korea. It's the crazy, insane leader. It's a totally militarized state. Everybody is in prison camps and wears uniforms. But I went to North Korea a couple of years ago, and I was actually pretty surprised by what I saw. First of all, the Pyongyang skyline was much more modern than I expected to see. There was quite a lovely subway system that I was allowed to travel around on. And the young women in Pyongyang loved to have their parasols well decorated. They were quite well dressed. But even in the rural areas, you saw this kind of joyful, playful, this is a farm, and apparently pigs playing an accordion are a major theme in folk art in North Korea. The things that Americans don't remember is that we're still at war with North Korea. We never actually concluded a peace treaty. And the Pueblo here was a ship that was captured, I think, in 1968, is still on display in Pyongyang as a symbol of that. When you're still at war with somebody, they do tend to get to think they need to be militarized, especially when you think about what we did in Cuba and some other places. We've also had sanctions against North Korea. It's the most sanctioned country in the world. These have been going on for more than 50 years. They haven't worked, so maybe we should try something else. The other thing is that it is a very hungry country. The arable land went to South Korea for the most part, and so there's a great difficulty. We started working in North Korea in 1980. It's kind of a surprise that we were a Quaker organization, was allowed into this communist country, but they said to us, we don't want food. What we want is help to grow our own food better. So we've been doing that in various ways. We took farmers out to the Iowa Seed Bank and helped them see other places. But since 1997, we've actually been involved in experimental efforts to improve production on 4 farms. And you see, this is showing us one experiment, which was to use bamboo hoops over the plastic covering on rice fields. And indeed, using bamboo hoops meant that you got an extra couple of inches of growth in the same period of time. We've also brought in these little egg carton things. Instead of planting rice in the fields, you plant them in these little cartons, and then you can take them out, and it's easier to replant them when you need to. It turns out labor is a real problem in North Korea. I didn't know this. I worked in China. I thought they had lots of labor, but they don't. And not only do we teach these 4 farms, but rice production went up about 30% as a result of these interventions. And these 4 farmers went out and they taught 24 other farms. And now some of these are being used throughout North Korea. We also brought in the concept of greenhouses from northern China. And this is interesting because the greenhouse produce is not under the quota system. So the farmers sell it on what amounts to a market in North Korea, and it adds to their income. So they really like the greenhouses. We got enough trust over the years that the government came to us a few years ago and asked us if we would offer classes for North Koreans on how to work with Western joint venture people. They didn't understand a word those people said. They didn't understand how markets worked. Could we help them understand how businesses worked? So we did do that. They accepted a South Korean professor as well, and they then asked us if we would introduce them to Chinese farmers who had been through economic reform. And the woman in red is the head of the ministry in North Korea, who is actually working on joint venture and economic reform. All of this is to say that it's possible that there is another narrative about North Korea that we haven't heard, and that we might be able to. These are rollerbladers in Kim Il-sung Square. We have worldwide programs in 14 countries and about 35 cities in the US. These are just 3 examples of what those programs look like, but I hope they give you a sense of where we go. And I believe that as we do this work, another world is not only possible, but on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So I hope you'll join us in making that world come true.